alert for Honkai Star Rail, particularly around 1.2, aka Dan Heng's backstory, and the genuine Dan Heng Lingsha quest in 2.5. Grab some tissues, you will cry, I hope you enjoy.
Of 5 people, 3 must pay a price. You are one of them.
If you watch my content or talk with me in DMs offline or exist in moderate to close proximity to me in general, then at this point you know who my favorite character in Star Rail is. I can't shut up about him. But before Aventurine entered stage right, my favorite boy was Danny Boy, otherwise known as Dan Heng, resident bookworm and guard of the Express. We start off the game not knowing much about him aside from the fact that wherever he's from, he was exiled. But then came update 1.2, also known as the oh my gosh, Dan Heng is a dragon update, which revealed that, oh my gosh, Dan Heng is a freaking dragon. That is so cool. Cool enough, in fact, that a lot of players didn't clock that Hoyoverse was dancing around some pretty important details. The biggest being, we still don't actually know why he was exiled. I can already hear people saying, wait, yes we do, but I'm sorry, you're wrong. I've talked with multiple people at this point, DMs, comments, stream chat, and whenever I ask people why Dan Heng got exiled, I get a different answer each time. He invoked the Transmutation Arcanum, whatever that means. He released a hell beast on the Xianzhou and killed a bunch of people. He was experimenting with the Abundance, the archenemy of the Xianzhou, and gave someone immortality, or he stole someone's immortality. The list goes on. And to make matters worse, all of these conflicting stories are confirmed by different sources in-game. It seems the devs don't want us to have the full picture yet, but they have scattered a few clues here and there about which story is the real one for those willing to look for them. And this gray area woven of the threads between puzzle pieces is where theorists like me thrive. I have been unweaving and reweaving these threads over and over, trying to find the theory that makes the most sense almost since Dan Heng was introduced. And finally, after 2.5, I think we now have the last puzzle piece that makes everything fall into place. I did tease this video a bit in my first video about Diamond's identity, which by the way is looking more and more plausible by the day, but after spending roughly 3 days madly cutting words left and right so it would fit in that video, I just decided to make it its own thing, and I am so very glad I did, because this theory just started unfolding more and more as I was researching. It's so heartbreaking and so beautiful, might be my favorite so far, after the Aventurine video of course. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoy, and as always remember, it's just a theory. Nothing's confirmed until the game or the devs themselves explicitly confirm it. I just like playing with stories like Play-Doh. Now, let's get into this video. First, some backstory so no one gets confused. This is going to take a bit, but it is necessary information. Dan Heng was exiled from the Xianzhou Alliance, a fleet of 6 planet-sized ships that follow Lan the Hunt, roaming the galaxy and hunting down undead creatures created by Yaoshe, Eon of Abundance. And during their millennia-long hunt, the Xianzhou collected 5 powerful abundance artifacts called Plague Marks. So far, we've only seen the Ambrosial Arbor, but there's also the Primordial Flame, the Lunar Embryo, the Miniature Myriads, and the Fallow Earth. And there's a plague mark on 5 of the 6 ships. The plague marks are how the Xianzhou people gained immortality before learning immortality could be a terrible curse. Now the Vidyadhara, Dan Heng's dragon species, don't have any inherent connection to the Xianzhou. They also live incredibly long lives, but not because of any blessing from Yaoshe. No, they are descended from long Eon of Permanence. And their cool special quirk is that when they finally start to feel their age, which happens every 600 years or so, they hop into a human-sized egg and Benjamin Button themselves, then hatch as a brand new person. This process changes their appearance and wipes their memory, but each of the Vidyadhara has existed as some version of their self for millennia upon millennia, which technically makes them immortal, but it's more like reincarnation with extra steps. Originally, they lived on an unnamed ocean planet, but the ocean unexpectedly turned toxic, so they made an alliance with the Xianzhou that allowed the Vidyadhara to live on the ships, and in return, they took on the task of protecting the plague marks. They split their population 5 ways and appointed a high elder for each. The strongest one was Glaciator Marum, but there was also Calorum Venti, Ardens Regia, Mons Grandis, and last but not least, Imbibitor Lunae. And if he looks familiar, he should. Remember when I said how each Vidyadhara has always existed as some version of their self? Well, that is Dan Heng, or it's who he was when the Vidyadhara first came to the Luofu. This is the first Imbibitor Lunae, Yubi, who took the oath to protect the Ambrosial Arbor from people who would try to take its fruit to gain eternal life. I'm sorry, all the biblical implications just crashed in on me all at once. Why have I not noticed that before? Anyway, Yubi is said to have had an incredibly strong connection to Long the Permanence and retained the power he inherited from Long even after 90 reincarnations. That's over 50,000 years for anyone who's curious. And he passed that power down to the next incarnation, the following High Elder, who passed it down to the incarnation after that, all the way down the succession of High Elders until at last we come to Don Feng. Do you ever hear a story and you get to a part where every little thing that could go wrong has gone wrong, and it's just one thing after the other, and you look around the cast and you fix your gaze on that one character and you just glare at them because you can pinpoint the exact moment it all went wrong, and it could all have gone right if that character had just not chosen the stupid option? Anyway, Don Feng, everybody. Don Feng was never going to be your typical High Elder, or maybe he was. Yubi was always known as a controversial figure, but that wasn't Don Feng's fault, at least not at first. His rise to power just happened to coincide with the Second Abundance Wars, an incredibly bloody conflict between the Xianzhou Alliance and the abominations of Yaoshi, making Don Feng a wartime leader. He was a member of the still legendary to this day High Cloud Quintet, which consisted of himself, a brilliant human craftsman named Yin Xing, a gifted Foxian pilot named Bai Heng, and 2 Xianzhou natives, Jing Liu, the sword champion, and Jing Yuan, the master strategist. These 5 together are the Xianzhou equivalent of the Avengers. They captured Hulei, destroyed the alliance of the Wing Weavers and the... I'm not even gonna try to pronounce that, it's on your screen, and saved countless lives, including the entire Xianzhou Yuchui. If things had happened differently, Don Feng would have gone down in history as one of the greatest heroes to ever live. But all that changed after one battle. Shu Hu was an absolutely terrifying emanator of abundance. They took the form of a giant tree with deep, deep roots, and whenever they killed someone, they would grow fruit in the shape of the deceased's face and use it to speak to and taunt the living who still fought them. That is nightmare fuel right there. Holy crap. As the war drew to a close, Shu Hu mustered their forces and attacked the Xianzhou Luofu. During the battle, Don Feng fell into dragon's delirium while in his dragon form. He saw the thousands of soldiers below him as nothing but ants with little significance, causing him to attack enemies with no concern for the lives of nearby allies. To snap him out of it, Bai Heng rammed her star skiff full force into the enemy defenses, shattering them and clearing a path for the Alliance to break through and put an end to Shu Hu's forces, at the cost of her own life. With less and less enemies to attack and more allies present, Don Feng awakened from his frenzy to find that the battle had ended. Shu Hu was defeated, and the quintet was no longer a quintet. All because he, in the heat of battle, mistook himself for a god. Hey you! Yeah, you in the screen with the sad and slightly puzzled look on your face. Do you know what you're getting your family for Christmas? This video is sponsored by Tokyo Treat and Sacuraco. I should probably apologize, but I won't apologize for reminding you that if you celebrate Christmas, you are now on a timer. If you are struggling to think of something to get a family member and they happen to be a fan of new snacks from faraway lands, why not get one of these? The box I'm opening right now is the Tokyo Treat box for December, which is themed, what else? Very Merry Christmas. This is a fun and exclusive monthly Japanese snack box full of so many different fun-sized and fun-flavored snacks. Some of my favorite items this month were the mistletoe mochi donut gummies. They were strawberry flavored, and I realized something interesting as I was eating them. We often talk about how Japan has flavors that just aren't available in the US, but what I realized was even the flavors that we do have in the US, they taste so different than the things I get in the box. It's like the US has a different formula for how to create the flavor than Japan does. I also loved these Winter Wonderland waffle chips. Making anything a waffle is always a good idea. This melon flavored festive foamy fizz, which gets mixed in the bag, took me a second to figure out how to drink. It was delicious once I figured it out. The Sacuraco box this month is also delightful as always. This month's theme is Holidays in Hokkaido, a place in northern Japan that has some very special wintertime traditions that they tell you all about in the booklet, along with explaining the artesian origins of each of the snacks. And I, once again, am itching to visit Japan after reading it. Look at this. It's Mount Fuji! And Mount Fuji happens to be delicious. My favorite item this month is probably the honey apple mochi mochi. Before doing these boxes, I had never had mochi before, and now it's one of my favorite things on earth. It's always awesome. Although the flavor for this one was incredible and perfect for the theme, it felt so festive. I also loved the Hokkaido milk manju. I got to share them with my family. Everyone got to try them, and everyone thought they were wonderful. They also every month include a household item, which this month was this Xianzhou flower dish I've been using. It is so pretty. I also got to try a new tea. This is Hokkaido Genmaicha, and I've had Genmaicha before, but what makes this particular blend unique is it has brown rice mixed in it, which I wasn't sure how I was gonna like, but it turned out just amazing. I love these teas. Tokyo Treat and Sacuraco want people to be able to experience Japan from the comfort of their own home, and what better time to do that than during the holidays? Each month's boxes are put together with so much care and attention, and the company itself is just so wonderful to work with. I cannot praise them enough. And if I may, why not start a holiday tradition this year? Get a box for the family, open it, and have everyone try things together and talk about what you like best. If you like the sound of that, check out the 2 links in the description and the pinned comment. One is for Tokyo Treat, the other is for Sacuraco, and don't forget to use promo code MMA at checkout. I get a commission from each sale, and you get a little taste of Japan. And now, back to the video. Okay, so this is where the confusion begins. Like I said earlier, there are over 10 different sources that record this edition of Immortality Lunae from various perspectives, but none of them give a full picture of what happened. Which, as annoying as it is, I've got to give props to the writers, because it's a pretty accurate depiction of how history gets distorted over time based on who's telling the story, governments altering information to protect themselves or their people, or records getting lost or destroyed. So I thought, if this is meant to mimic history, why not treat it like history? When a historian is studying an event in real life and wants to know what actually happened, they will divide their evidence into primary sources, which is evidence found on the scene and eyewitness accounts of people who were there, and secondary sources, which is secondhand knowledge from people who heard about the event. And applying that here looks like this. We've got eyewitness accounts from Blade, Immortality Lunae, and Jing Liu, because she was apparently there too. Our secondary sources are mostly government documents. Of the 2 that aren't, this one is a critique of a play written by Don Feng's worshippers. Yes, you heard that correctly. This man has worshippers. And this one is a page from the Alchemy Commission's official gazette. These are cool if you want to learn about the cultural impact of what Don Feng did and how the public sees him, but for learning what actually happened, they are a bit useless because all the information in these 2 is already in the other 3. In fact, that's likely where the in-universe people who wrote them got their information, so we're just gonna remove those from the running entirely. Of the 3 we have left, Verdict, the Great Rebellion of Immortality Lunae, is the only place we get a straight answer on what he was charged with. Embracing immortality and breaking the ban, thieving immortality, and inciting riot. Now, thieving immortality and inciting riot are 2 of Xianzhou's 10 unpardonable sins. And this seems like an appropriate time to mention that unpardonable sin isn't just a crime that can't be pardoned, it is an actual legal statute on the Xianzhou. Dang, I went from being a historian to being a lawyer. What the heck is this game? This makes it sound like Don Feng led some kind of crazy rebellion where he went around stealing people's immortality, but I'm not actually convinced this record is reliable. As I mentioned above, some governments do change records in order to protect themselves or their people, and spoiler alert for later, Don Feng didn't really do either of the things that he's accused of here. It's kinda the only unforgivable sins he didn't break. Moving on, we also have 2 documents from the Videodara. One is a letter from the Videodara Preceptors, which are a group of Videodara that takes command when the High Elder is unable to, which says that whatever Don Feng did, 1,300 Videodara were killed and 3,000 were still missing. And this is a problem. Remember how we were talking about how cool the Videodara were, how when they're old they just become egg to become child again, making them effectively immortal? Yeah, it comes with a major debuff. This is the only way they can reproduce. They can only ever be reborn. They can't make new Videodara from scratch. If one gets seriously wounded, they can do the egg thing early, but if they die before getting to the egg, or if the egg is destroyed with them inside, then they're just gone permanently. No more reincarnation. So the Preceptors ask the General to return Don Feng to them, and in the readable Preceptor Assembly Chronicle fragment, we learn it's cause, quote, our solemn responsibility is to confiscate the Transmutation Arcanum from Don Feng to uphold the continuation of Ichor lines. Now, there's a thread there that I'm going to connect for you guys later, but for now I want to talk to you guys about the Transmutation Arcanum because this is really important. The Transmutation Arcanum is referenced all over the place, but again, there is no clear answer on what it is. Everyone's confused, but after copious amounts of research, I think I get it. See, the Videodara inherited an interesting ability from Long. They used to be able to transmute sea creatures at will. I have a hunch this happened when propagation still existed under the definition of permanence, because I'm not going into that today, but that's a thing. Then when propagation split off onto its own path, that ability slowly faded, with very few individuals keeping it, including the first Imbibitor Lunae. From that point on, the Transmutation Arcanum was no longer used to transmute other species. Instead, the High Elders use it to transmute their own body into that of a dragon, which we see Dan Heng do when he first reveals his High Elder form. That's not him summoning a dragon, that is Dan Heng. I wasn't quite sure what to make of all the times we see Dan Heng alongside his dragon, but my best guess is this is a representation of Dan Heng for our benefit. His human form is not actually there, only the dragon, but having a human face on screen allows for more emotional impact because we have whole lobes of our brain dedicated to connecting to humans, but not to dragons. Dang, that'd be so cool. Either way, whenever we see the dragon, we are seeing the Transmutation Arcanum. Only High Elders have this power, and it's passed down through the High Elder succession. And that's a perfect segue to our primary sources, because if we look at Imbibitor Lunae's character trailer, literally in Dan Heng's opening line, he straight up tells us,
Imbibitor Lunae, successor of the Azure Dragon, commander of the clouds and the rain, tasked with watching over the ambrosial arbor. In reckless arrogance, invoke the Transmutation Arcanum.
And in the trailer, it's framed like this is the unpardonable sin he committed, but that can't be the whole story, because we now know the Transmutation Arcanum isn't some horribly destructive arcane magic. It's literally just the High Elder going, guess who's a dragon now? Whatever happened, the Transmutation Arcanum was used, but there has to be something else. What was Dan Heng using it for? And that brings us to Jing Liu's character story. Listen to this. She pointed the broken sword at the High Elder. Impossible. The preceptors said, the blood of my race and the soul of my ancestors should have created another High Elder. Okay, so there is a lot there, and I'm going to break it down, but I first want to address something I've seen no one point out. Whatever Dan Feng's goals were, he was told to do this by the preceptors. He committed the sin, but they were the snake in the garden, and I don't believe for a second that this was by accident. In the readables and in a couple story quests, we learn some of the preceptors are, shall we say, resentful of existing in the High Elder's shadow. And when Dan Feng was imprisoned, several of them wanted to take the moment to seize power and elevate themselves to a ruling body. And the leader of this group was none other than Elder Taoran. The same Elder Taoran who tells us in 2.5 that there's a way to turn other species into Videodara after death. Now just think about this from his perspective for a second. He, confirmed by the way, wants to take down Dan Feng and seize power for the preceptors on one hand, and on the other, he also wants to save his species. Because at this point, the Videodara's numbers are dwindling. There are theoretical ways that new Videodara could be created, but looking at the readables, it's clear they've never worked before. And because the Videodara live on the Xianzhou, they are absolutely forbidden to run the kinds of experiments they'd need to do to make it work. Turning people immortal is numero uno of the 10 unforgivable sins. You do not do that. So what did Elder Taoran do? He gave all the theoretical information to Dan Feng. Worst case scenario, the experiments fail and Dan Feng is ousted for tampering with immortality. Best case scenario, the experiments succeed. They are able to make more Videodara, and Dan Feng is ousted for tampering with immortality. And in neither case is Taoran implicated. But why would Dan Feng be so willing to do something like this? To risk his position of power and betray every ideal he'd ever lived up to by that point? Because he had just lost one of his closest friends in the world, and he was desperate to get her back. This is confirmed in the relic set Passerby of Wandering Cloud. This is written from the perspective of Blade, also known as Yinsing. A slender yet strong hand once wore the other bracer. That owner, whose sharp spear glinted with a cold light and flourished like shooting stars, once sparred with the unnamed. However, in the end, it was also this person who stubbornly adhered to their plans with the unnamed and turned the beloved into a monstrosity. I'm so sorry, the beloved is such a raw thing. for him to call her in this situation. Of those in the High Cloud Quintet, Bai Heng was the one Blade met first. His homeworld was destroyed by Borisin, so he came to the Xianzhou Ming and began to study under Master Huayan when he was only a child. Bai Heng, being a wandering nameless, happened to visit on a day that Master Huayan had other things to attend to, so Yin Xing was the welcoming committee. And the rest is history. As Yin Xing grew up, his care for Bai Heng clearly grew into some kind of affection, but because he was human, he had to accept that Bai Heng would outlive him by centuries. And then she didn't. To live your whole life believing something is inevitable only to have fate throw it back in your face with not just cruelty, but bitter irony, that does things to people. So Yin Xing and Don Feng together, with the information they got from Preceptor Taoren, decided they were going to bring her back. In Imbibitor Lune's character story, we read, he dreamed that he parted the ocean's waters and came to the palace ruined depths, burying the remnants of his old friend's hallowed blood, or creating a new life that had not been seen for millennia. Or perhaps those two actions were one and the same. And with the information we have now, we can actually figure out the mechanics of how this experiment worked. The two of them brought Bai Heng's remains to Scale Gorge Waterscape, the place where Vidyadhara are both laid to rest and reborn, and placed her inside a Vidyadhara reincarnation egg. That in itself wasn't enough, but they could potentially use the Transmutation Arcanum to heal her because in addition to being just awesome in general, the Transmutation Arcanum seems to have insanely powerful regenerative abilities. Remember when we first saw it? Don Heng didn't even know that was something he could do, but the moment his life is in danger, oh my gosh, he's a freaking dragon. And oh look, he's fine now. If a High Elder is mortally wounded, this thing takes over automatically and heals them. So if Bai Heng were a High Elder, then in theory it would do the same for her, but she was already dead. And this is where their experiments went from something highly illegal to something absolutely unforgivable. All they needed was the tiniest spark of life, and then the Transmutation Arcanum would do the rest. Just one tiny spark. They didn't have the power to create that, but the abundance did. Don Feng and Yin Xing took the flesh of Shuhu, the multi-headed nightmare tree emanator of abundance that Bai Heng died to defeat, and used its power to kickstart rapid cell regeneration in Bai Heng's remains. And then Don Feng, in reckless arrogance, invoked the Transmutation Arcanum, transferring his power to her, effectively turning this Foxian girl into a Vidyadharan High Elder. And once it sensed what it believed was a High Elder close to death, it began healing her, regenerating and transforming her until... Far away, deeper in the delve, there came the anguished roar of a dragon, as if pleading for death. The half-draconic abomination swam through the air in blasts of lightning. Its wails were as loud as the clamors of 1,000 clashing swords. Everything fell apart. Don Feng and Yin Xing watched in horror as the woman they both loved emerged, not as herself, but as a half-dragon, half-eldritch lightning beast, and began to rampage through Scale Gorge Waterscape, destroying helpless Vidyadharan eggs left and right. Yin Xing was covered in blood and wounds, and he watched in renewed horror as his flesh was healed and restored before his eyes, his hair turning from white to black. What had they done? Moments later, Jing Liu arrived. She turned to face Imbibitor Lune. The Preceptor said, "The blood of my race and the soul of my ancestor should have created another High Elder. It shouldn't be like this." She pointed the broken sword at the High Elder. "If your death can return everything to how it was, I would do it. But you need to tell me right now where that dragon's weak point is." The top of its head. The half-draconic abomination swam through the air in blasts of lightning. Its body, enough to swallow the very horizon, sundered yet another floating isle. Its wails were as loud as the clamors of 1,000 clashing swords. The thunder struck. She leapt up with her sword towards the draconic abomination. In a dreamlike illusion, she felt her flesh surpass its limits, beginning to disintegrate. It was as if innumerable silken threads bound her, taut across every limb and bone, each one slicing through the last vestiges of her consciousness, bit by bit. Suddenly, she heard those words. "I will cut down even the stars in the sky." Jing Yuan was the only one of the 5 not present that day. Jing Liu arrested Dongfeng. Yin Xing, who had been exposed to the flesh of Shu Hu and was now immortal and fueled by Mara madness, fled. Jing Liu held on for a year, but she had also been exposed to the flesh of Shu Hu, and she also succumbed to Mara. Dongfeng remained imprisoned for decades. Despite their diminished numbers, many Vidyadhara wanted him dead after what he did, until rumors of a new creature on the Xianzhou. A Vidyadhara born with draconic features, the mark of a high elder. A girl born so powerful that the Ten Lords Commission place inhibitors on her to keep her from hurting those around her by accident. A girl born with a gift of abundance, capable of calling down lightning, with familiar purple hair, green eyes, and an almost fox-like tail. Rumors swirled around this dragon lady for decades, but only the highest levels of government knew the truth. Dongfeng had succeeded. He had successfully transformed the body of his old friend Bai Heng into a Vidyadhara, the first new one in over 50,000 years, named Bailu. The experiment worked. The Vidyadhara didn't have to resign themselves to extinction, except for one problem. They couldn't duplicate the experiment without the transmutation arcanum, and unfortunately that hadn't been passed on successfully to Bailu. So the preceptors wrote to the 6 charioteers begging them to urge the general to return Dongfeng to them, and then when that failed, they begged Dongfeng himself to hand over the ability. He refused. He was sentenced to molting rebirth, meaning rather than entering an egg, he would be reborn through the literal shedding of his old self. But the preceptors couldn't have that. Dongfeng's experiment was the first time anyone had succeeded in making a new Vidyadhara ever. They needed his mind, his information, and so they took steps to make sure he would remember his past life. Once he was reborn, he should have been returned to the Vidyadhara people, because it's tradition that when a Vidyadhara is reborn, they are considered a new person, and the guilt of their past life doesn't carry over. But the shackling prison continued to hold him, now a young child named Heng, refusing to let the preceptors speak to him. Years passed until he was a young man. At this point, Jing Yuan was now general of the Xianzhou and clever enough to see through the preceptor's scheme. So rather than handing Heng over to them, he exiled him, giving him a chance at a full life away from the schemes of people who only wanted his power. Heng left, drifting through the stars, unnoticed except by a beast in the shadows, a man with dark hair and eyes like fire. A quiet, unassuming young man with nothing but a spear in his hand and the power of Long the Permanence buried in his chest, completely oblivious to the path behind him. And then he boarded the express. He didn't know why, but something felt familiar about it. A strategist older than his years, a creative but foolhardy second with fire in their chest, a woman watching over all of them, always ready to swoop in and save the day, and a bubbly, bubblegum princess who dragged him around by his sleeve like a compulsion. This was his family, returned to him all over again. And so he followed the tracks, unaware that his old family was still out there, waiting patiently for him to return. Hey guys, thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to say a massive thank you. It has been less than a year since we passed 300 subs, and now suddenly we are 1/10 of the way to a YouTube plaque. You guys are amazing, and I can't thank you enough. The video this month was going to be a thank you video, but I was having trouble finding the words, and so I decided to push it one more month, so that'll be my end of the year video, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all yet again. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking or commenting or subscribing. I love hearing your guys' thoughts. Also, don't forget, I have a Discord server that you can join to talk more about lore. We talk about lore all the time. And also, I stream on Twitch multiple times a week. I might be live right now, who knows? But all of the relevant links are in the description. And speaking of links, don't forget to check out Tokyo Treat and Sacuraco. They are incredible. They are wonderful. The boxes this month are amazing. And quick note from Editing Emma here. Happy Thanksgiving to all my American followers. I hope you have a wonderful time. I'll see you all in the comments, and then again next month. Until then, please stay safe, stay kind. I love you guys.